Here, at least, it's a cold, rainy night. It's nice to hear the raindrops on the roof. I thought one of the things I get in my mailbox every morning is something called Native News, and it's a compilation of news from indigenous tribes around the country. And there was something this morning about the solstice that I thought I would read before as a way to enter into uh, Suzuki Roshi. Not always so. It says, in the Northern Hemisphere, December 21st, it will be the year's day of least sunlight when the sun takes its lowest, shortest path across the sky. North of the Arctic Circle, it will be the midpoint of the period of darkness when even twilight doesn't reach the horizon. What an amazing planet Earth we live on. They say we asked our native friends to share traditions they've heard about the winter solstice. Their answers highlight winter as a time for storytelling. Ojibwe from the Minnesota Chippewa tribe says, like many events in American Indian culture, there is a proper time and place for all activities. Oh, we could learn something about that. Zen Rituals does try to help us. Ojibwe says traditional storytelling is reserved for the winter months for many tribes. This was a practical choice given the fact that during the other seasons people were busy growing, gathering, and hunting food. It was in the winter, with the long dark evenings and the snow or the rain and wind blowing outside, that telling stories was a way to entertain and teach children. Another reason is that many traditions contain animal characters. Well, here we are, right back with the Jataka tales. To be respectful, this is wonderful. To be respectful, people waited until the winter when animals hibernate or become less active so they cannot hear themselves being talked about. It's so eminently polite and thoughtful and kind. To have a story tell you a story is like receiving a gift. To be respectful, a gift of tobacco is offered to the storyteller before the story begins. The storyteller will often take the tobacco outside and place it on the earth as an offering to the spirits of the story. Maybe if it's not too rainy, you could at least open your door and bow to the outdoors at the end of our time together today. Say thank you, animals and plants and spirits and earth, and just thank you, gratitude. This comes from San Carlos Apache in Arizona. This reminds me of when I was young. My grandfather would ask a really older man to come visit, and we would eat dinner, and they would visit and smoke. And then my grandpa would put a bundle at his feet, and soon he would start telling stories most of the night. Such tender and kind of beautiful rituals. It's also the time of Hamaha, storytelling of the coyote, stories of heroes, stories of the animals, and of sharing of knowledge. My parents said that when you call Hamaha, people will arrive with piñon nuts gathered in the fall that are roasted and sweet. Silix of the Washington State and British Columbia tribes said, what I know is that it marks the point in time when our winter ceremonies can be held. My grandmother sometimes held her first ceremony of the winter at this powerful time. We have winter dance ceremonies, prayers for the new year to come, for the berries and the roots and the four-leggeds and the fish, the four food chiefs, prayers for our families and ourselves, and there are songs and dancing and feasting and a giveaway. I think, oh, please, sometimes during this holiday, if you would like, do a ceremony for the berries and the roots and the four-leggeds and the fish and the birds that fly. What a beautiful thing to do. So the songs and dancing and feasting and the giveaway are held during the evenings and can go on all night, depending on the number of sacred singers who come to share, and they're called the winter dances. In our territory to the south in Washington state, my grandfather told me of one dance ceremony lasting 10 nights in a row. I'm feeling imminently deprived. But we'll do it a little bit tonight, and we'll, in our imagination during this time, we'll imagine that across time and space there are beings and animals and heroes and dancing and saying prayers and that lighting a candle in the darkness. So I wanted to bring some stories about Suzuki Roshi. I've shared some of them before, I think, in the past, but I never uh, cease being delighted. And it seemed like an appropriate thing to do on a cold, dark night. But I'm going to start with Not Always So, and his chapter about frog, the frog. We'll do a prayer and a song and a dance to the frog. Recently on a calendar, Suzuki Roshi says, I saw one of Seigai's drawings of a frog along with his saying, if we can become a Buddha by the practice of sitting. He doesn't say anything more, but we can imagine what the frog is thinking. If people can become a Buddha by the practice by the practice of sitting, then I too can become a Buddha. The frog, man, whoa, I got it down. You want to show the picture, Debbie, of this frog that Suzuki Roshi was talking about? It's such a great picture. It's a Buddha frog.
I need to be co-host, Chris.
Oh, yeah, I do. You do. Sorry. There we go. Ribbit. What if when you saw the world and all of its creatures, you imagined them all smiling at you? Wouldn't it make you want to smile back? For those of us who have some understanding of practice, when we see someone sitting to attain enlightenment, we may think, oh, he is sitting like a frog. Actually, the frog's way of sitting is much better than our zazen. I always admire their practice. They never get sleepy, their eyes are always open, and they do things intuitively in an appropriate way. There's that word again, intuitive body. When something comes by to eat, they go like this, gulp. They never miss anything. They are always calm and still. I wish I could be a frog. If you understand what Sengai is saying in his picture of a frog, you have already understood what Zen is. There is a lot of humor in his picture and a good understanding of our practice. Even though our practice is not better than a frog's, we continue to sit. When you have been practicing for a pretty long time, you will laugh. Partly at someone who is involved in the wrong idea of practice, and partly at yourself who is always sitting without doing anything and without making much progress. You will laugh at yourself. And when you laugh at yourself, there is enlightenment. What a wonderful sign of enlightenment is, oh, laughing at themselves. Until you understand why we practice Zazen and what is actually true activity, intuitive activity, free from various desires and restrictions, it is difficult to figure out what is good practice. Still, it's okay. Just keep doing it, and little by little, you'll get it anyway. There is nothing to attain, Just continue this right practice or fundamental practice is the most important thing. Thank you very much. Practice during this time of the dark. Smile. Occasionally even laugh at yourself. Okay, Debbie, thank you. So, David Chadwick went around and students of Suzuki Roshi's. It's a new, this is the old copy. There's a different cover, but it says Stories of a Zen Teacher Told by His Students to Shine One Corner of the World, Moments with Suzuki Roshi. So imagine we're sitting by a fire. Someone has just put a tobacco bundle at our feet, and we are listening deeply across time and space to these stories about Suzuki Roshi that are also about stories of enlightenment and awakening and teacher and student and frogs and foxes and coyotes passed across time, echoing. I marked a whole bunch of them. I'm just going to open them and see which stories come forward tonight. Oh, this is an interesting one. A well-known Japanese Rinzai Zen master dropped by Sakoji to meet Suzuki Roshi. We talked a little bit about the difference between Mahayana and Rinzai practice because Erica had practiced in the Rinzai tradition. After they chanted a sutra together, isn't that sweet? You come and visit each other and you chant a sutra together? How civilized. The visiting priest asked to see a sutra book on the altar. He looked at it. Then he suddenly exploded, stamped his foot on the floor, and shouted, "This is not Zen!" And he tore the book in two and threw it on the floor. We learned a little bit that Rinzai is a little more abrupt than Mahayana Soto practice. Suzuki Roshi simply squatted down and picked up the pieces. Oh, this sutra book was donated to the temple when there was a memorial service for an old woman from a different sect, he said. We accept everything here. We chant everything. We eat everything. For a moment, the guest still looked angry. And then Suzuki said, "Let's just go have some tea." And a friendship began that continued as long as they were both alive. Quite a story. During one sesshin at Tassajara, it was very cold in the unheated zendo. After a lecture, a student said, "Roshi, I thought you said that when it got cold, we'd figure out how to stay warm within our zazen." Suzuki Roshi answered, "It's just not cold enough yet." One evening in a lecture, Suzuki Roshi said, "If you're not a Buddhist, you think there are Buddhists and non-Buddhists. But if you're a Buddhist, you realize everybody's a Buddhist, even the bugs." Don't these stories make you happy? They make me laugh, which is a very good sign. Suzuki Roshi said during a talk that some of us wanted to be Zen masters and that this was very foolish. He said that he wished he was like us, just starting out. Maybe you think you are green apples hanging on a tree, waiting to ripen so that you can be Buddhas, he said. But I think you are already ripe, perfect Buddhas now, ready to be picked. Soon after she arrived in America to join her husband, Suzuki Roshi's wife said, "Why do you work so hard preparing for a lecture? It's raining, and the last night it rained, only 2 people came. I hope that 10 come tonight." Suzuki Roshi answered, "1 or 10, it makes no difference." A psychologist asked about the nature of enlightenment. "I'm not enlightened," Suzuki Roshi said. "I can't answer." Mm. Bruce, my husband, remembers he met Suzuki Roshi, I think, once. And he walked up to him and he said, can I ask you a question?" And Suzuki Roshi said, "No." It made a very deep impression. That sort of goes with this story. "When I first came to the temple, I asked to learn Zazen, but Suzuki Roshi didn't have time that day. I frequently returned, but for 2 months Suzuki Roshi refused to teach me. Then one day he took me to a remote part of the building and said, 'Now, would you like to learn Zazen?' After teaching me attention to posture and breathing, he gave me a book. Many years later, I asked him why he had refused to teach me Zazen when I first asked for it. He said, 'I did not want to spoil what is naturally present.'" I'm hoping these are going in like raindrops. Just the felt sense of Suzuki's heart and generosity and teaching. One morning in Zazen, Suzuki Roshi broke the silence by saying, "You're like loaves of bread baking in the oven." A student who had just concluded a 30-day Zazen retreat with 2 enthusiastic Dharma pals asked Suzuki Roshi how to maintain the extraordinary state of mind that he had attained in these retreats. Suzuki Roshi said, "Concentrate on your breathing and it will go away." A student said, "I compare myself to other students and feel inadequate. I haven't read anything about Buddhism." "Oh," Suzuki Roshi said, "that's the best way to come to practice." Starting to understand why people loved him. A woman told Suzuki Roshi she found it difficult to mix Zen practice with the demands of being a housewife. I feel like I'm trying to climb a ladder, but for every step upward, I slip backward 2 steps. Forget the ladder, Suzuki Roshi told her. In Zen, everything is right here on the ground. In Zen, everything is right here on the ground. Oh, I love both these stories. During a break in one of the early sesshins at Sakoji, that was the Japanese temple that he came to in the very beginning, a student returning to his seat early straightened a picture on the wall before he sat down on his cushion. I think of this story a lot, actually. This is one of those stories. Some of these will stick. So he straightened a picture on the wall before he sat down on his cushion. Only he and Suzuki Roshi were in the Zendo at the time. After a moment, Suzuki got up to leave the room. He walked down the aisle, stopped at the picture, returned it to its crooked position, and continued out the door. Now, in one version of that I've read, is not only did he put them back where they were, he walked out the door laughing to himself. he was kind of delighted by his playfulness. While serving as Suzuki Roshi's attendant, I arrived at his cabin at Tassajara and found him in his underwear scrubbing out the toilet. I should be doing that, I said with some embarrassment. Suzuki Roshi simply said, "Please just sit down and have some tea." To practice when you're in the monastery, when you're shuso, we can't do it here. Well, I suppose we could assign it to people at home. Is that the shuso, because it looks like it's a high position, that the ritual part of it is that you take on cleaning all the toilets, because there's no high or low. It's just Suzuki Roshi just cleaned his own toilet. Just take care of everything. On the fourth day of Sesshin, as we sat with our painful legs, aching backs, hopes and doubts about whether it was worth it, Suzuki Roshi began his talk by saying slowly, "The problems you are now experiencing," we were sure he was going to say, "will go away." "The problems you are now experiencing will continue for the rest of your life," he concluded. And the way he said it, we all laughed. During his first Dokusan, students said he couldn't stop thinking during meditation. Suzuki Roshi asked, "Is there some problem with thinking?" It was my first sesshin, and before the first day was over, I was convinced I couldn't make it. My husband's turn for Dokusan came that afternoon, and he asked Suzuki Roshi to see me instead. "This is all a mistake," I told him. "I can't do this. I just came to be with my husband." "There is no mistake," he said. "You may leave, Of course, but there's no place to go. One day, I complained to Suzuki Roshi about the people I was working with. He listened intently, and finally he said, "If you want to see virtue, you have to have a calm mind. If you want to see virtue, you have to have a calm mind." Just a couple more. A student asked, "Does a Zen master suffer in a different way than his students suffer?" Suzuki Roshi answered, "In the same way. If not, I don't think he is good enough." Suzuki Roshi washed his feet on the doorstep after working in the garden. His attendant, who was standing just inside the door, handed him a towel. She then reached down and pinched one of his toes. "That is one of the powers of the Buddha," he said. "What is?" "To see what someone needs and to give it to them." A group of us had lunch with Suzuki Roshi in New York City. People were wondering how we should treat this religious man and how we should act. People were wondering how we should treat this religious man and how we should act. Very early on in the lunch, he put a napkin on his head and sat there with it. Then we all put our napkins on our heads, and he made everybody feel comfortable. This doesn't exactly fit with some of our more uptight images of what Zen and a Zen teacher is, huh? A clinical psychiatrist questioned Suzuki Roshi about consciousness. "I don't know anything about consciousness," he said. "I just try to teach my students how to hear the birds sing." Oh, maybe this story is, maybe I conflated two stories. One day during a lecture, this is a great story. One day during a lecture, a stranger sat in zazen posture in the front, very close to Suzuki Roshi. He mimicked Roshi's movements, made weird facial expressions and threatening gestures. He blew toward the candle burning behind Suzuki Roshi, and Suzuki Roshi took no notice of him. When Roshi got up to leave, he did his usual bows, turned, then whirled back and quickly blew out the candle. He walked up the aisle laughing to himself. It's like the frog laughing. One day, Suzuki Roshi went with a group of us in a truck to a ranch some miles from Tassajara to pick fruit. We were all trying to be good Zen students, working hard, picking the fruit, packing the boxes. We didn't realize how serious we'd become until Suzuki Roshi climbed a tree and started throwing fruit at us. During Saturday morning work period at Sokoji, a student who'd been around for a few years was sweeping the Zendo floor when he saw a newcomer apprehensively wondering what to do. He went over and handed the fellow his broom. When he turned around, there was Suzuki Roshi, arm outstretched, offering him his own broom. And last one. I went up to Suzuki Roshi's room not long before his death. He was in bed, extremely weak, his skin discolored. He bowed, and I did the same. Then he looked right at me and said, not with a loud voice, but firmly, "Don't grieve for me. Don't worry. I know who I am." Okay, I can't help it. One last one. I went in from my meeting with Suzuki Roshi during sesshin. At that time, my main purpose was to get him to approve of me. I told him how I was trying hard to do the right thing. He listened carefully and without judgment. "You get a gold star," he said. Stories from Suzuki Roshi. To shine one corner of the world. Why don't I put us in small groups of 3? Anything that comes up from any